August 21st, 1942. Colonel Ichiki stood at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal, staring across a shallow creek at the American defensive line he was about to attack. Behind him, 917 of Japan's finest soldiers, men who'd trained for years, conquered territories across Asia without defeat, men who believed no Western force could stand against them. Across that creek waited United States Marines. Ichiki had studied them. Japanese intelligence said these men were soft, undisciplined, lacking the warrior spirit that defined Japanese soldiers. They would break at the first sign of a determined assault. In 6 hours, 800 of Ichiki's soldiers would be dead, and everything Japan thought it knew about American fighting men would begin to unravel. This is how Guadalcanal shattered one of the most dangerous beliefs in military history: the conviction that American Marines were incapable of real combat. To understand what happened on Guadalcanal, you need to understand what Japanese military leaders believed about Americans before the war began. For decades, Japanese military doctrine had been built on Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. This wasn't simple nationalism. It was a foundational belief that Japanese soldiers possessed spiritual superiority that could overcome any material disadvantage. Where Western nations relied on machines and firepower, Japan relied on the indomitable will of its warriors. The emperor was considered divine, a living connection to the heavens. Japanese soldiers didn't merely fight for their country. They fought for a sacred bloodline stretching back thousands of years. This philosophy became central after Japan's stunning victory over Russia in 1905. A smaller Asian nation had defeated a European power through superior fighting spirit. The lesson seemed clear: spirit would triumph over steel. By the 30s, this belief had hardened into doctrine. Japanese officers were taught that Western soldiers, especially Americans, were spiritually weak, products of a soft culture that prioritized comfort over sacrifice. They would surrender. They would run. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to validate this assessment completely. When Japan attacked the Philippines in December 41, American and Filipino forces collapsed within weeks. Bataan and Corregidor became symbols of American failure. History. At Singapore, over 80,000 Allied troops surrendered to a Japanese force half their size. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's forces attacked down the Malay Peninsula with speed and ferocity that overwhelmed defenders at every turn. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. In the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Burma, Western forces consistently failed to match Japanese determination. Japanese commanders drew obvious conclusions. Americans had better equipment, more supplies, bigger ships, but they lacked the will to fight. This assessment extended to the United States Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence studied them and found nothing impressive. A small force, poorly equipped, no recent combat experience. In Imperial Headquarters assessment, garrison troops playing soldier. The Marines in 42 were indeed small, barely 70,000 men at war's start. They'd spent the interwar years fighting small conflicts in Central America. Not exactly military legend material, at least not in Japanese eyes. What intelligence reports missed was the transformation happening inside the Corps during the 30s. Marine officers had developed revolutionary concepts for amphibious warfare, creating specialized equipment and training. More importantly, they developed a culture emphasizing individual initiative and small unit leadership, the ability of junior Marines to keep fighting even when communications broke down and plans fell apart. That culture would prove lethal on Guadalcanal. Colonel Ichiki embodied every assumption Japanese officers held about American capabilities. He'd been given orders to retake an airfield the Americans had seized in early August. He was told to wait for reinforcements, to let the rest of his regiment arrive before attacking. He saw no need. 900 men would be more than sufficient against Marines. Why share the glory? Major General Alexander Vandegrift had no idea what the Japanese thought of his Marines. At 54, he was a career Marine who'd seen action in Nicaragua, Haiti, and China. He'd been promised 6 months to train his division. He got 3 weeks when Operation Watchtower, the Guadalcanal invasion, was suddenly greenlit. The 1st Marine Division was a mix of veterans and raw recruits who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Most had never seen jungle warfare or faced an enemy who preferred death to surrender. On August 7th, 42, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal. They achieved complete surprise, securing their objective, an unfinished airfield soon named Henderson Field. The landing had been easier than anyone hoped. Then, disaster struck. On the night of August 8th-9th, a Japanese naval force devastated the Allied cruiser screen at Savo Island. 4 cruisers sunk, over 1,000 sailors dead. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher withdrew the fleet, taking most Marine supplies with him. Vandegrift's Marines were stranded. Limited ammunition, dwindling food, 0 naval support. They dug in around Henderson Field and waited for the counterattack they knew was coming. Colonel Ichiki landed at Taivu Point on the night of August 19th with his 917 men. Japanese aerial reconnaissance reported minimal American presence. Imperial headquarters believed the Americans had withdrawn most forces, leaving only a token garrison. Ichiki was told he might face as few as 2,000 defenders. Reality: 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal. But even if Ichiki had known, it might not have changed his plans. He had absolute faith in Japanese superiority. His 28th Infantry Regiment had been trained for the most difficult operations, among Japan's best. He ignored orders to wait for reinforcements. Marines would crumble at the first assault. What Ichiki didn't know, the Marines knew he was coming. A coast watcher named Jacob Vusa had been captured by Japanese soldiers. They found an American flag in his loincloth and demanded information. Vusa refused. The Japanese tied him to a tree and used him for bayonet practice, stabbing him 7 times. He didn't die. After the Japanese moved on, Vusa chewed through his ropes and crawled through miles of jungle, bleeding from multiple wounds. He reached Marine lines and warned them minutes before Ichiki's assault began. Vusa survived and continued serving alongside Marines throughout the campaign, later receiving the Silver Star. Around 1:30 in the morning on August 21st, Ichiki launched his assault across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. The Marines were waiting. The first wave of Japanese soldiers charged across that sandbar screaming, "Banzai," bayonets fixed, expecting the Americans to flee in terror. This was how it had always worked before. What happened next stunned every Japanese soldier who lived through it. The Marines didn't run, didn't surrender, didn't panic. Instead, they held their positions and unleashed devastating fire into the attacking formations. Machine gun positions along the creek opened up with brutal accuracy. Those water-cooled .30 caliber guns, manned by Marines who'd trained extensively with them, cut through the assault waves like a scythe. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. That sandbar became a slaughterhouse. Ichiki had expected the Americans to break when they saw Japanese soldiers charging with fixed steel, screaming battle cries. This was what always happened. Western troops couldn't withstand that psychological hammer blow. Their nerve would fail. The Marines' nerve didn't fail. Artillery batteries that had pre-registered their targets dropped shells directly onto the assault formations with shocking accuracy. Every approach seemed covered. Every advance met with coordinated fire. When Japanese soldiers managed to reach the Marine lines, they were met with close combat that matched their own intensity. Marines fought with rifles, pistols, bayonets, bare hands. They gave ground reluctantly, then counterattacked to retake lost positions. No fear, no quarter asked. One Marine machine gunner, Private Al Schmid, took shrapnel to the face early in the battle. The blast destroyed both his eyes. Blinded, he continued operating his weapon by touch alone, guided by his assistant gunner, who directed his fire toward the sound of approaching Japanese. He stayed at his post until dawn. By sunrise, the attack had completely failed. Ichiki's men had achieved nothing except their own destruction. But the battle wasn't over. As the sun rose, Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. Marines crossed the creek upstream and swung around to encircle the surviving Japanese. The encirclement was methodical and brutal. Japanese soldiers who'd survived the night found themselves trapped in a coconut grove with Marines closing from all sides. Some tried swimming to safety and were shot in the water. Some fought to their last bullet, then charged with bayonets. Some chose suicide rather than capture. The tanks rolled through that coconut grove, machine guns chattering, crushing wounded Japanese beneath their treads. The Marines who followed showed no more mercy than the Japanese had shown in their conquests across Asia. The American press would sanitize this later, but the reality was brutal. The Marines had absorbed the shock of Japanese tactics and responded with overwhelming violence. By 5 in the afternoon on August 21st, it was over. Of Ichiki's original 917 men, approximately 800 were dead. Perhaps 128 escaped. Marine casualties, 35 killed, 75 wounded. For every American who fell, Japan lost more than 7 men. This wasn't supposed to happen. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, a profound disgrace. He then either died fighting or committed ritual suicide. What's certain, he didn't survive to explain why his assault failed so catastrophically. When word reached Rabaul, Japanese commanders reacted with disbelief. A Japanese infantry regiment couldn't possibly have been annihilated by Marines. The reports had to be wrong. Imperial headquarters had the same reaction. Instead of reassessing their assumptions, commanders concluded Ichiki simply sent too few men. The solution seemed obvious: send more. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was given command of the next attempt with approximately 6,000 men from the 35th Infantry Brigade, veterans who'd fought in Borneo and the Philippines. Kawaguchi was more thoughtful than Ichiki. He'd studied the reports carefully, understood Marines were better prepared than expected. His plan was sophisticated: march through the jungle to attack from the south where the perimeter was lighter. A ridge running toward Henderson Field provided a natural avenue. The approach march proved brutal. Dense vegetation made coordination impossible. Units became separated, supplies ran out. Soldiers arrived exhausted, hungry, disorganized. Despite these problems, Kawaguchi remained confident. Japanese fighting spirit would overcome obstacles. On September 12, 42, Kawaguchi launched his assault. Defending the ridge was about 800 Marines from the 1st Raider and Parachute Battalions under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. Red Mike Edson had fought in Nicaragua and earned a reputation as one of the Corps' most aggressive commanders. He'd positioned his men carefully with pre-registered artillery targets covering approach routes. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming battle cries, throwing themselves against Marine positions. The jungle erupted, and again, the Marines didn't break. The fighting was among the war's most intense. Japanese soldiers breached Marine lines multiple times, came within a few hundred yards of Henderson Field itself. The outcome hung in the balance for hours, but the Marines held. Edson personally rallied his men, moving along the line under fire. He shouted. Artillery fire devastated Japanese assault waves. When ammunition ran low, Marines fought with bayonets and rifle butts. By dawn on September 14th, the attack had failed. More than 600 of Kawaguchi's men lay dead. Survivors retreated into the jungle, many starving, beginning a nightmare march that would kill hundreds more from disease and hunger. Vandegrift later said this was the only time during the campaign he had doubts about the outcome. The Marines had held against a force designed to overwhelm them. The defeats should have forced reassessment of Japanese assumptions. They didn't. Japanese military culture, didn't encourage honest reporting of failures. Officers who admitted plans failed risked disgrace, so commanders concluded they simply needed more men, more resources. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake arrived October 9th with the 2nd Sendai Division, one of the Imperial Army's most illustrious units. Veterans of Manchuria and China, over 20,000 troops would participate in coordinated assault from multiple directions. Hyakutake was so confident his staff prepared plans for accepting the American surrender. The battle began October 23rd, 42. The main attack came from the south, where the Sendai Division was supposed to achieve breakthrough. At one section of that line, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. Manila John was 25, born in Buffalo, raised in New Jersey, acknowledged as one of the Corps' outstanding experts on the .30 caliber machine gun. Throughout the night of October 24th and 25th, his position was attacked by approximately 3,000 Sendai Division soldiers. Basilone fought without sleep, food, or rest. When ammunition ran low, he fought through enemy territory to bring back more, carrying 90 pounds across 200 yards swept by Japanese fire. When gun crews were killed, he manned weapons himself. When guns jammed from continuous firing, he repaired them under fire, burning his hands on superheated barrels. By the time reinforcements arrived, only Basilone and 2 other Marines were still standing. The ground before their position was carpeted with Japanese dead. Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor, becoming the first enlisted Marine to earn the award during World War II. After the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller interrogated a Japanese prisoner. He asked a simple question: "Why didn't you change tactics when you saw you weren't breaking our line? Why not shift to a weaker spot?" The prisoner's response revealed everything. "That is not the Japanese way," he said. The plan had been made. This rigidity, absolute commitment to predetermined plans regardless of circumstances, proved fatal. The October offensive failed completely. Japanese casualties numbered between 2,200 and 3,000 dead. American casualties were fewer than 300. The Sendai Division had been shattered. The Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs bringing reinforcements, couldn't deliver enough to sustain forces. American control of Henderson Field meant slow transports couldn't approach during daylight without being destroyed. Japanese soldiers resorted to eating roots, grass, tree bark. They suffered malaria, dysentery, beriberi. Men who'd been strong warriors became walking skeletons, too weak to fight or retreat. By December, Hyakutake was desperate. On December 23rd, he sent a message to Tokyo capturing the reality. No food available, and we can no longer send out scouts. The Japanese eventually withdrew in early February 43. Over 3 nights, destroyers evacuated approximately 10,600 surviving troops. They left behind over 14,000 dead from combat, and another 9,000 who'd perished from disease and starvation. For every American killed on Guadalcanal, Japan lost nearly 10 men. But the most important loss was invisible. It was the destruction of a belief. The Marines who fought on Guadalcanal had proven something Japanese commanders believed impossible. Americans could fight. Americans could hold their ground. Americans could match Japanese ferocity and determination in close combat. The spiritual superiority supposed to guarantee Japanese victory simply didn't exist. This realization spread through the Japanese military establishment with devastating effect. In every subsequent campaign, Japanese commanders would face opponents who wouldn't break, wouldn't surrender, wouldn't run. The tactical implications were profound. Japanese commanders could no longer assume aggressive night attacks would cause American lines to collapse. They couldn't count on spiritual superiority to overcome material disadvantages. They had to fight Americans as equals. And in that kind of fight, American industrial production and logistical superiority would prove decisive. The Marines hadn't set out to disprove Japanese ideology. They were simply doing what they'd been trained to do. But in holding Henderson Field against repeated assaults, they'd shattered one of the most dangerous assumptions in modern military history. Major General Alexander Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor for his leadership. He'd later become the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps and the first Marine to hold 4-star rank while on active duty. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson also received the Medal of Honor. The ridge itself bears his name to this day, a permanent memorial to the 800 Marines who held it. Sergeant John Basilone became a national hero. When he received his Medal of Honor, he said something that captured the spirit of Marines on Guadalcanal. "Only part of this medal belongs to me." He was offered a commission and stateside posting. He turned them down, requesting to return to combat. On February 19, 1945, he was killed on the first day of Iwo Jima while destroying a Japanese blockhouse and guiding a tank through a minefield under heavy fire. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and Navy Cross. The 1st Marine Division was so ravaged by combat and disease, it had to be withdrawn for months of recovery. When declared combat ready again, it went on to fight at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. The word Guadalcanal appears on its shoulder patch to this day. But perhaps the most important legacy was invisible: the destruction of an idea. The belief that Japanese spiritual superiority could overcome any enemy. That belief had sustained Japanese military confidence for decades, convinced planners they could fight and win against the United States despite vast disadvantages in industrial capacity. Guadalcanal proved it false. The Marines didn't win because of better equipment. In many respects, their weapons were inferior. They didn't win because of numerical superiority. They were often outnumbered. They didn't win because of overwhelming firepower. Supplies were limited throughout. They won because they fought. They held ground when doctrine said they shouldn't be able to. They matched Japanese determination with their own. They demonstrated that spiritual qualities Japanese commanders believed unique to themselves existed in equal measure on the other side. Japanese military leaders had spent years convincing themselves Americans were soft, that democracy produced citizens who valued comfort over sacrifice, that materialism had corrupted the fighting spirit all warriors needed, that when faced with choosing between death and surrender, Americans would choose surrender every time. Guadalcanal proved them catastrophically wrong. The Marines who landed there in August 42 were mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s. Many had never been away from home before joining. They were sick, hungry, undersupplied, operating without naval support for weeks. They held an airfield against the most elite troops the Japanese Empire could send. They did this not through mysterious warrior spirit, but through discipline, training, and stubborn refusal to give up. They did it because they were Marines, because their officers told them the ridge had to hold, and they believed it, because the men beside them were counting on them, because that was what they'd signed up to do when they walked into recruiting stations after Pearl Harbor. When Japanese commanders learned what their soldiers faced on Guadalcanal, they began understanding the war they'd started wouldn't end as planned. The Americans wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't sue for peace, would fight island by island until Japan itself was threatened. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this before the war began. In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States, he'd said, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory." Guadalcanal was where that prediction came true. The 6 months were over. The run of victories had ended. What remained was a grinding, brutal war of attrition Japan couldn't win. The Marines on Guadalcanal didn't know they were changing history. They were simply trying to survive. Fighting malaria alongside the Japanese, living on captured rice and contaminated water, losing friends every day. But in holding that airfield, in refusing to break, they demonstrated something that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. American Marines could fight, would not quit. And Japanese commanders who'd built their entire strategy on the assumption Americans lacked fighting spirit had been proven utterly wrong. Today, the battlefields are quiet. Jungle has reclaimed most fighting positions. Rusted equipment and scattered bones occasionally surface when farmers plow fields. The ridge where Edson's men held is peaceful now, covered in grass and tropical flowers. But the memory remains. In the Marine Corps, Guadalcanal is sacred ground. The men who fought there are honored as the foundation of everything that came after. The battles they won established a reputation that would carry the Corps through the rest of the war and into conflicts that followed. And in Japan, though less remembered than in America, its significance is understood by those who study the war. Guadalcanal was where the tide turned, where the myth of Japanese invincibility died, where everything changed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi understood this better than most. He'd led the assault on Bloody Ridge, watched his men cut down by Marines who wouldn't retreat, seen his carefully planned offensive collapse against defenders who matched Japanese determination with their own. After the war, when historians asked him to assess the campaign, he offered his verdict simply. He was right. Everything that came after, the island-hopping campaign, the fall of Saipan bringing American bombers within range of the homeland, the terrible battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the atomic bombs that finally ended the war, all of it grew from seeds planted on a jungle-covered island in the Solomons, where American Marines proved Japanese commanders had been wrong about everything. The Japanese military had spent decades preparing for war with the United States. They'd studied American culture, assessed military capability, concluded Americans lacked will to fight. It took 6 months on Guadalcanal to destroy that assumption forever.